Bedtime UFO Story. Britain's Roswell. What really happened in Rendlesham Forest? https u2.be fcd3ux3hjts ITC TI6 Gen A0PE. Welcome to Dreams of Disclosure. This is part of our Fall Asleep to the Unknown series where we share mysterious stories to help you drift off to sleep. Tonight, we'll take you back to the quiet pine woods of Suffolk, England, in December 1980, when strange lights and unexplained craft lit up the Rendlesham Forest night sky. The Rendlesham Forest incident has often been called Britain's Roswell. But what do you believe? Was it just mistaken lights and Cold War tension, or something far beyond our understanding? Tell us what you think in the comments. Now, close your eyes and let's enjoy. Chapter 1. Christmas Lights That Shouldn't Be There. The Christmas of 1980 at RAF Woodbridge was supposed to be quiet. Most personnel were off duty, the forest wrapped in silence, but that peace shattered when strange lights were reported drifting down among the trees. What began as a suspected aircraft crash would soon grow into one of the most lasting UFO cases in British history. It was the early hours of December 26th. Most operations had slowed down for the holiday. Only essential personnel remained on duty. But even in this reduced state, the bases kept their watch. These were not ordinary British airfields. Operated by the United States Air Force, RAF Woodbridge and its twin base, RAF Bentwaters, housed American personnel, equipment, and though not confirmed at the time, nuclear weapons. The land around the bases was thick with pine forest. Long, straight rows of trees stretched in all directions, marking the edge of the military boundary. During the day, the forest felt open. At night, it became a wall of darkness. At around 3 a.m., the stillness broke. A bright light was seen descending into the woods just beyond the eastern fence line. The light didn't streak like a falling star or flash like lightning. It moved slowly, guided, as if being lowered on purpose. The first assumption was routine. Perhaps a small aircraft had gone down. Crashes weren't common, but they weren't impossible either. A patrol was assembled and sent to investigate. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, Airman First Class John Burrows, and Airman Ed Cabansag were among the first responders. They drove down the perimeter road toward the lights and stopped when the road ended near a small forest access gate. From there, they continued on foot. The forest was cold and silent. Moonlight filtered weakly through the canopy, giving just enough light to see the path ahead. Their boots crunched on damp leaves. The air felt heavy, not foggy, just unusually dense. Peniston would later describe it as unnatural. They expected to find wreckage, smoke, or fire. But there was none of that. Instead, the lights appeared again, flashing red, blue, and white through the trees. They weren't high above, but low, just a meter or two off the ground, pulsing in rhythm. Cabansag stayed near the vehicle to keep radio contact, while Peniston and Burrows pressed forward. As they advanced, they noticed strange things. The air felt charged, like static, the kind of sensation before a lightning strike. Birds had gone silent. Nearby farm animals, especially dogs, barked violently. In the distance, horses in their paddocks were restless, moving in circles. Something was disturbing the environment. Then, between the trees, they saw it. A solid object, motionless and silent, glowing with pulsing light. In later interviews, Peniston would describe it as triangular, about 3 meters wide at the base and 2 meters high. It looked metallic, though no seams or rivets were visible. The surface looked like smooth black glass. Lights shone from underneath, rotating slowly. There was no sound, no heat, just light and stillness. They approached carefully, But before they could get closer, the object began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. It drifted through the trees, weaving in and out of view without disturbing a single branch. The movement was too smooth to be a helicopter or drone. It made no noise, no rotor wash, nothing but light. And then it vanished into the forest. Confused and without clear orders, Peniston and Burroughs returned to the vehicle and reported what they had seen. The entire event lasted only a few minutes. Their account was logged as unexplained lights in the forest. Officially, it remained an open file with no conclusion. When they returned to base, no one rushed to raise an alarm. There was no scramble of jets or lockdown. The event was treated cautiously, as something unusual, but not yet threatening. But within hours, the story began to circulate among the men. Not loudly, not openly, but in quiet talks behind closed doors. Something strange had happened in Rendlesham Forest, and more than one man had seen it. At that point, the assumption of a crash had already been ruled out. There was no missing plane, no debris, no distress calls. Whatever the lights were, they didn't belong to any known aircraft, and they hadn't crashed. They had hovered, moved, and then disappeared. In daylight, Peniston and a few others would return to the site, not out of curiosity, but duty. They needed to check if there was any trace left behind. What they found added a new layer to the mystery: ground marks, broken branches, and radiation readings that didn't match the idea of just lights. But that was still ahead. This was only the first night of what would become one of the most recorded and debated UFO encounters in modern military history. And while many UFO cases rely only on memories years later, Rendlesham had something rare: real-time reports, audio recordings, official memos, and a base full of trained observers. And it all began with 3 airmen. A quiet shift after Christmas, and a forest where lights behaved in ways they were never supposed to. Chapter 2. Into the Trees, the First Encounter. The forest didn't sleep, not really. Even when the lights faded and the patrol returned to base, something in the trees felt unsettled, as if the night had held its breath and hadn't yet exhaled. By the time sunrise reached the horizon, the trees stood motionless under a cold winter sky. No one was officially talking about what had happened just hours before, but those who were there understood. It wasn't over. The morning of December 26, 1980, came without answers. At RAF Woodbridge, the atmosphere was quiet, but under that calm, a sense of unease remained. The night before, 3 U.S. Air Force security personnel had entered the forest just outside the fence. They returned with a report that didn't match anything in the manuals. There was no plane wreckage, no distress calls, no crash, just an unidentified object glowing with rotating lights, moving without sound before vanishing into the woods. By first light, Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston was preparing to return to the site, this time in daylight and under more formal orders. He wasn't alone. Several men joined him, some from the security team, others from logistics and command. Their task was clear: find the area, photograph any evidence, and record details. The forest in daylight looked different. What had seemed thick and confusing under moonlight now appeared more orderly. Rows of pine trees ran in straight lines. The ground was covered in brown needles and frozen soil. The air was cold, damp, and sharp. Thin sunlight filtered through the trees, casting faint beams along narrow paths. It didn't take long to find the spot. Roughly 100 meters inside the tree line, they came across a small clearing. In the center were 3 distinct indentations in the soil, forming a perfect triangle. Each mark was evenly spaced, about 12 feet apart. The dents weren't deep, but noticeable, as if something heavy had rested there briefly. Peniston moved carefully, studying the marks. He pulled out a notepad and began sketching. He measured the distances and noted their shape and depth. Close to one of the marks, broken branches were found, snapped clean, not rotted or weathered. A few nearby trees showed signs of scorching, thin black lines along the bark at mid-level height. There was no smell of burning, no ash, but the marks were clear. One of the airmen carried a handheld Geiger counter, a standard radiation detector. It wasn't typical for a security patrol, but someone higher up had approved it. As they swept the clearing, the meter began to tick. Not dangerously high, nothing that would require evacuation, but high enough to raise questions. Radiation levels in the indentations were much higher than the surrounding soil. The meter also spiked on one of the tree trunks. There was no explanation for that. Peniston continued checking the area. As he moved toward the edge of the clearing, something caught his attention. Pressed faintly into the frozen ground were what looked like small, even patterns. Not footprints exactly, but indentations that didn't match animal tracks or human boots. He made a sketch and noted the angle. Later, he would describe them as not random. While his team photographed the site, Peniston began remembering what he'd seen the night before. In the moment, under stress with adrenaline rushing, it had been easy to focus only on the lights. But looking back, the object they encountered had shape and structure. He remembered the triangular form, the dull metallic surface, and the unusual texture that reminded him of smooth black glass. He also recalled markings, strange symbols along the side of the craft, like glyphs or carvings. That detail hadn't made it into the first report. Peniston hadn't spoken of it out loud until later, maybe out of caution or maybe doubt. But in his notebook, he began drawing them from memory. He didn't recognize any of the symbols. They didn't look like letters, numbers, or known military signs. Years later, those symbols would become one of the most studied parts of the case. But here, in the calm of a cold forest morning, he simply drew them as he remembered. 5 distinct shapes arranged in a line along the side of the object just above eye level. The team spent over an hour at the site. Every angle was photographed. Soil samples were collected. No explanation was given. Not by superiors, not by the observers on scene. The only conclusion was that something unusual had landed, or at least touched the ground. When they returned to base, the findings were shared quietly among a few in command. There was no full alert, no outside investigators, no media. The official reaction was controlled and limited. Some of the men were told not to speak about what they had seen. Others were told simply to file their notes and move on. But Peniston didn't forget. In interviews years later, he would insist that what he saw that night was not a normal aircraft, not a satellite, not a weather balloon. He described it as something beyond known technology, something that moved without sound, left physical traces, and seemed, in his words, aware. For now, though, there were no dramatic claims, no big reveal, just a set of prints in the forest, strange radiation readings, and a handful of airmen trying to make sense of what they saw compared to what they were trained to expect. And while this first daylight investigation was important, it would not be the last. Just 2 nights later, the deputy base commander himself would enter that same forest, and this time, the encounter would be recorded live, in real time, on audio tape. But before that happened, Peniston would carry with him more than memory. He had his sketches, his notebook, and though it wouldn't become public for decades, He claimed to have taken something else away from that night. A message in binary code, received not through instruments, but directly into his mind. That part of the story would come later. For now, the facts were plain. Something landed in Rendlesham Forest. It left marks in the ground, changed the environment, and triggered a quiet but deliberate investigation by the U.S. Air Force. Whether it was a craft, a probe, or something else entirely, no one on the team could explain what they had seen, and no one had found a reason to dismiss it. Chapter 3. What happened in the fog? The fog rolled in just before midnight. It wasn't thick, but it hung low between the trees, a faint, pale mist that softened the forest floor and turned shadows into shapes. The second night after the first sighting had arrived without much attention. Officially, the situation had been recorded, but not escalated. There was no lockdown, no heightened alert. Still, those who had been out there before knew something wasn't finished. December 27th, 1980. RAF Woodbridge had returned to its normal routine, at least on paper. Shifts had resumed. Daylight brought order, and the daylight investigation earlier that morning had confirmed something strange had touched down in the woods. But as night fell again, a quiet tension returned. Those who had seen the lights were now silent. Those who hadn't were curious, and a few, both on base and off, began watching the skies more closely than usual. No new patrols were officially sent out that night, but around the base, a shift in mood had begun to spread. A kind of heightened awareness, like something was being expected or watched for. Back in the local town of Woodbridge, a civilian call was placed to Suffolk Police. The report described more strange lights over the trees and a pulsing object low in the sky. The timing matched exactly with what some base personnel had observed off the eastern perimeter. The police arrived, took notes, and found nothing to report. It wasn't their first unusual call that week. Inside the base, a few airmen on overnight duty began speaking quietly about movement in the tree line. At one guard post, someone claimed to see a flicker of red light in the same direction the original object had disappeared. Others dismissed it. Without official orders to investigate again, no team was sent out. But word spread quietly. There was talk of another pass, of something returning to the area. At the time, none of this was written in formal records. But decades later, during interviews, several men remembered that second night clearly, not because of what they saw, but because of how it felt. The phrase that came up again and again was, "Something was wrong in the woods." One of the men, who asked to stay unnamed, recalled stepping outside for a smoke during the midnight shift. He wasn't part of security patrols, just an equipment technician. But as he looked out across the base perimeter toward the forest, he noticed an odd glow. It wasn't dramatic, not like floodlights or a spotlight. It was subtle, as if something behind the trees was giving off its own pale white light. He thought it might be headlights at first, but it didn't move. It just hovered, then faded out. He didn't report it. At the time, talking about lights in the forest was becoming something of a joke. Rumors were spreading. Some said it was just the Orford Ness Lighthouse nearly 5 miles away. Others whispered about experimental aircraft or tests, though no one could explain why the base itself wouldn't have been told. On that second night, no senior officers entered the forest. But a strange detail appeared the next morning. The same clearing visited by Peniston and his team now showed fresh marks in the soil. Not deep, not certain, but different from what had been documented the day before. According to a brief note later found among base paperwork, one of the junior airmen from maintenance had wandered out during the early morning hours after his shift ended. He never filed a formal report, but another man remembered seeing him return covered in frost, pale as a sheet, and refusing to talk about what he'd been doing in the woods. These unconfirmed accounts from the second night never made it into the official files. No one filed a formal incident, but something was starting to change. The silence on base grew heavier. Witnesses from the first night, Peniston, Burroughs, and Cabansag, were no longer talking about the event openly. A few joked that they had mistaken the lights. Others withdrew completely. This was the point in the story where Rendlesham shifted from a strange event to something deeper, where uncertainty began to mix with secrecy. Over the years, multiple airmen who were stationed at RAF Woodbridge during this time have described the atmosphere in the days after the first encounter. Some said they were told not to speak about the incident. Others said nothing was ever formally discussed, but the pressure to stay quiet was unmistakable. Whether it came from a superior or from fear of ridicule, the result was the same: silence. Meanwhile, off base, the public was unaware of any of this. The event wouldn't reach the media for another few years. But among locals, especially those living in the small homes bordering the forest, stories were already spreading. A retired schoolteacher later recalled seeing an unusual light in the sky that hovered over the trees for nearly 10 minutes on the night of the 27th. She told no one at the time. She said she didn't want to sound foolish. That second night, while less documented, became a critical turning point. Nothing explosive happened, no chase, no photographs. But the fog, the lights, and the strange mood on base planted a deeper question in the minds of those who had experienced it. If it wasn't over, was it building up to something? 2 nights later, that question would be answered. On December 28th, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the deputy base commander, would personally lead a team into the woods. And unlike the nights before, this time the incident wouldn't rely only on memory. Halt brought with him a handheld tape recorder. He planned to document whatever happened in real time, and he did. But before that chapter begins, the second night in Rendlesham must be remembered for what it was: quiet, foggy, and subtle. A night without confrontation, but not without meaning. Because sometimes the most important signs aren't loud. They're the ones that repeat themselves. Slow, steady, and just strange enough to feel planned. Chapter 4. Halt takes command. By the third night, the incident was no longer just a rumor. The strange lights had been seen by multiple personnel. Odd marks had been found in the ground. Equipment had shown small spikes of radiation. And around the base, the silence was starting to feel heavy. People weren't just staying quiet out of duty. They were staying quiet because they didn't know what they were facing. That's when Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt decided to take matters into his own hands. Halt was the deputy base commander of RAF Bentwaters. A seasoned officer, he was not given to drama or guesswork. His job was to maintain order, discipline, and readiness. But he was also practical. After hearing multiple reports from security staff and reviewing what had been documented so far, he made a choice that would shape the rest of the Rendlesham story. On the night of December 28, 1980, Halt gathered a small team and went into Rendlesham Forest himself. He didn't go empty-handed. Among the equipment his team carried were flashlights, a Geiger counter, radios, and most importantly, a handheld audio recorder. Halt wanted proof, not just reports written later, but a real-time record of what they saw, felt, and experienced in the moment. They entered the forest around 9 p.m. The group moved slowly along a logging track at the edge of the trees. The temperature was near freezing, and the ground was hard beneath their feet. Their flashlights cut thin beams through the dark, showing patches of frost on the pine needles and low brush. The forest was silent, still, just as it had been on the first night. Halt began recording almost right away. His voice on the tape is calm, careful, almost clinical. He narrates as they walk. We're now approaching the area where the object was sighted. Ground is frozen. 3 marks equidistant triangle. They had found the same clearing from the earlier investigation. The landing marks were still there. As the team scanned the area with the Geiger counter, the device began to click, softly at first, then more often. The readings weren't dangerous, but they were above the normal level, especially near the indentations. We're getting readings of 0.5 to 0.7. That's much higher than normal, Halt states on the tape. And then something changed. While scanning the area, one of the men spotted a pulsing red light through the trees. At first, it was still, a soft glow about the size of a basketball hovering just above the horizon. They thought it might be a distant beacon or a star, but then it began to move. Halt describes the light as it shifts position. It's blinking, moving toward us now. It's throwing off sparks, red, then blue. It's coming closer. The team continued to watch. The object seemed to dart between trees, moving intelligently, stopping and starting without sound. Halt can be heard trying to keep his men focused. Keep the flashlights off. Let's see how it moves. Then the light split. As they watched, the single red light seemed to divide into several points, 3 or 4 smaller lights, each drifting in different directions before coming back together again. It didn't act like a flare. It didn't follow wind patterns. There was no downward drift, no smoke, just silence and movement. More than once, the men reported beams of light coming down from the object to the ground, thin, pencil-like shafts of light that seemed to scan the area below. At one point, a beam was said to have landed near the base's weapon storage area. On the tape, Halt's voice changes slightly. He reports that the beam seems to be coming down directly in front of them. But there is no noise, no physical contact, just strange visual phenomena. Lights behaving in ways that don't match normal aircraft. The team stayed in the forest for nearly 3 hours. During that time, they watched the lights from multiple spots. They tried to follow them, but the objects always stayed out of reach, slipping between trees or fading out completely. At no point did they make direct contact, and yet everyone there agreed. The lights weren't random. They weren't reflections or distant signals. They moved with intent. Eventually, Halt made the decision to return to base. The tape ends with a quiet summary of the events, logged in his steady, calm tone. There is no panic, no conclusion, just a statement of what was seen. The full recording, now known as the Halt tape, runs for about 18 minutes. Over the years, it has been reviewed by both skeptics and believers. And while theories have been suggested to explain what Halt and his team saw, stars, satellites, distant beacons, none match what's heard on the tape. Halt's decision to document the event in real time remains one of the most important parts of the Rendlesham case. Unlike many UFO encounters which rely only on memory, this one has a live, unedited audio record. No exaggeration, no later changes, just a voice in the dark describing what's happening moment by moment. After returning to base, Halt typed up a memo summarizing the events of the 26th through the 28th. It was short, careful, and professional in tone, a style that would later become part of the mystery. The memo wouldn't become public for years, But the tape existed from day one, and it still exists today, in a case full of questions, rumors, and theories. This part remains clear. The deputy commander of a U.S. Air Force base went into a forest to investigate a series of strange sightings. He witnessed something he could not explain, and he recorded every moment of it, not to prove anything, but because it was the right thing to do. The forest was quiet again when they left. But whatever had been in Rendlesham had not gone unnoticed. It had moved in silence. It had reacted to their presence. And it had left behind something even more powerful than physical evidence: a record. Chapter 5. The Halt Tape. A case recorded live. The sound of footsteps crunching over frozen soil. That's the first thing you hear. Not a narrator, not music, not the voice of a witness recalling events years later, but the actual sound of a group of U.S. Air Force personnel walking through a cold English forest in the middle of the night. It's steady, calm, uneventful. Then comes the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt. We're now approaching the area where the object was sighted about 100 meters from the landing site. That single recording, made on December 28, 1980, in the woods of Rendlesham Forest, would become the most iconic and solid piece of evidence in the entire case. Known today as the Halt tape, it runs for about 18 minutes and captures what is, by all accounts, a live investigation into something unexplained. It's rare to have real-time documentation of any UFO incident, let alone one involving military personnel. But the Halt tape doesn't dramatize or guess. It records with a cool, professional tone. Halt narrates what he sees and hears as it happens, and in doing so, gives a direct window into one of the most studied moments in modern UFO history. The tape begins shortly after Halt and his team enter the forest. The weather is cold and still. You can hear wind in the distance, but not much else. The men begin at the clearing where the triangular ground indentations had been found. Halt notes the readings from a Geiger counter, elevated, especially near the impressions, 0.5 to 0.7, possibly 1.0 in some spots. Much higher than normal background radiation. He says the readings aren't extreme, not dangerous, but they're consistently above the surrounding baseline. One of the marks in the ground shows the highest spike. It matches the same area where Peniston had previously drawn symbols along the side of the craft. That detail isn't mentioned on the tape, but looking back, it lines up. As the team moves deeper into the forest, things begin to change. One of the men spots a strange light through the trees. Halt describes it on tape. A red light appears to be moving. Now it's pulsing. At first, they think it might be a beacon or a lighthouse, but the behavior doesn't match either. The object moves sideways, stops, then shifts again. It seems to react to their position. You can hear the uncertainty in Halt's voice, but not fear. He's calm, focused on describing rather than reacting. It's about 10 degrees above the horizon, appearing to move like it's dancing through the trees. At this point, the tape begins to show a change in the atmosphere. One of the men notes that the light seems to break into pieces, 3 separate lights that then come back together. There's no sound of engines or rotors, no high-altitude jet noise, just silence and movement. Then Halt reports something more surprising. Now we're observing what looks like a beam of light coming down to the ground. It's lighting up an area about 10 feet wide. The team stands still, watching. They don't move toward the beam. They just observe. According to later accounts, this wasn't a spotlight. It wasn't projected from the ground. It came down from the object above, narrow and steady. They continued tracking the lights for over an hour. At one point, Halt notes that the object seems to move toward a nearby field, then stop, then rise again. It's hard to keep visual contact. The trees block much of the sky, and the object never comes into clear range. Still, the lights don't act like anything familiar. They don't drift like flares or glide like aircraft. They hover, shift, vanish, then reappear again, always silent, always just far enough away. As the tape continues, the men begin moving back toward the base perimeter. Then another detail appears. Halt reports that one of the beams of light seems to be directed toward the base's weapons storage area, the WSA. He doesn't explain further. He simply says, "The object is now beaming down light near the WSA." Later, this would spark its own wave of speculation. The WSA was where nuclear weapons were said to be stored. If the light was really targeting that area, what was the reason? Scanning, surveillance, coincidence? The tape ends without conclusion. There's no resolution, no encounter, no final contact, just a fading voice, footsteps, and the cold forest returning to stillness. Over the years, the Halt tape has been analyzed by experts in audio forensics, military historians, and UFO researchers. No tampering has ever been found. The voices match known personnel. The sound profile matches open woodland in winter. The equipment being used, including the Geiger counter, is standard issue for that time. Skeptics have tried to match what's heard on the tape with distant lighthouses or celestial objects like bright stars or planets. But the problem is the same. Nothing in the known environment behaves the way the lights on the tape are described. The changes in position, the speed, the way they seem aware of the team's presence, these aren't qualities of fixed lights or illusions. And most importantly, the tape records multiple observers confirming the same thing at the same time. In some cases, 3 or 4 voices can be heard reacting to the same light, direction, or movement, not over minutes, but in seconds. That real-time coordination is hard to dismiss. In the world of UFO cases, the Halt tape stands out not because of what's said, but because of how it's said. There's no exaggeration, no attempt to theorize. It's a military officer narrating his observations for the record, just in case. And that perhaps is what gives it weight. The honesty in Halt's voice, the discipline in how he reports. He didn't go into the woods looking for a story. He went in to record something unusual and came back with more questions than answers. But unlike most who experience strange phenomena, he brought the world with him, in his pocket, on a tape, under the sound of boots in the dark. Chapter 6. Memos, Debriefs, and Binary Code. By the time the final night of sightings had passed, the forest was quiet again. The lights were gone. No new beams had touched down. The patrol stopped, but inside RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, the feeling of unfinished business hung in the air. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt had returned to base with his team and filed his notes, the radiation readings, the red light that split into parts, the object that sent a beam of light toward the weapons storage area. All of it had been recorded live on tape. But while the audio would remain internal for a while, a more formal report had to be written, something that could go into the system and be passed up the chain of command. That report became known as the Halt Memo. Dated January 13, 1981, just over 2 weeks after the events in Rendlesham Forest, the one-page memorandum was titled Unexplained Lights. It was addressed to the UK Ministry of Defence, written on official USAF letterhead and authored by Halt himself. But if anyone expected the memo to match the urgency of the tape, they would be surprised. The language in the memo was careful, neutral, stripped of emotion. It summarized the events over 3 nights in a clear but very restrained way. There was no mention of a craft, no reference to beams of light near the weapons area, and no technical detail about radiation or possible physical effects. Instead, Halt referred to unusual lights, indentations, and a possible landing. It read more like a weather report than a military incident. Some later speculated that Halt wrote it that way on purpose, that by keeping the tone low-key, the memo could pass through official channels without drawing too much attention. Others believed he had been told to avoid speculation and stick only to facts that couldn't be challenged. In either case, the result was the same. The memo was received, filed, and quietly shelved. It wasn't until several years later that the memo surfaced publicly. A copy was obtained through a U.S. Freedom of Information Act request and quickly reached UFO researchers. Its plain language only made it more interesting. Why would a high-ranking officer send an official report to the British government about unexplained lights and landing traces if there wasn't more to the story? By the late 1980s, both the Halt tape and the Halt memo had become central to the Rendlesham case. And just as public interest began to grow, another layer appeared. This one stranger. It came from Jim Penniston. Penniston had been one of the first men to enter the forest on the night of December 26th. His encounter was brief but direct. He had approached the object, studied its structure, and, according to his account, touched it. That detail alone made his testimony stand out. But in the years that followed, he revealed something else. He claimed that in the moments he touched the craft, he received a kind of download, not in words or images, but in code. Specifically, binary code, sequences of ones and zeros. The message wasn't understood at the time. It came to him, he said, almost as a compulsion. He didn't think it through but felt the need to write it down. The next day, in his notebook, the same one he used for military field sketches, he recorded page after page of binary digits. No explanation, no label, just long columns of ones and zeros. He didn't tell anyone about the binary code at the time. It wasn't until the early 2000s, during a television interview, that he revealed the notebook publicly. At first, many dismissed it. Why had he waited so long? Why wasn't it in the original debrief? Penniston's explanation was simple. He didn't think anyone would believe him. The sighting alone was already hard enough to explain. Adding in the idea of mentally received binary code from a silent hovering object in the woods would only make him less believable. So he kept it to himself. Eventually, a group of researchers tried to decode the binary. They converted the sequences using ASCII, a computer text format. What came out were several English phrases and a list of geographic coordinates. The phrases were vague but strange. Exploration of humanity. Continuous for planetary advance. Eyes of your eyes. But the coordinates were even more curious. When plotted on a map, they pointed to several ancient or mysterious locations around the world. The pyramids of Giza in Egypt, the Nazca Lines in Peru, the Temple of Apollo in Greece, and an obscure mythical island west of Ireland, High Brazil, often described in folklore as a vanishing land that appears once every 7 years. Skeptics quickly questioned the code. It could have been made up, added to the notebook years later, or designed to match famous landmarks. Penniston denied all of that. He insisted the notebook was real and unchanged, a simple record of something he didn't fully understand. The U.S. Air Force never commented on the code. Neither did the British Ministry of Defense. No formal analysis was ever released. To this day, the pages remain one of the most debated parts of the case. Some call them an afterthought. Others call them the message behind the entire event. But setting the code aside, what remains is this. A U.S. military officer filed an official memo about unexplained lights seen in a British forest. Another officer recorded those lights as they moved, split, and appeared to scan the base. And a trained security sergeant claimed physical contact with a silent object that left impressions in the ground, marks on the trees, and possibly something else entirely in his mind. It's this mix of details that makes Rendlesham so hard to label. It isn't just one sighting or one witness or one set of tracks. It's a layered, multi-night encounter supported by physical evidence, official reports, and testimony that continues to grow decades later. And yet, even with the memo filed and the tape archived, there were no public announcements, no investigation seen by those on base, no follow-up teams, no official conclusion. At least not one anyone was allowed to see. Chapter 7. Military Reactions and Official Silence. The morning after Colonel Halt's investigation, things on base looked routine. Trucks moved across the tarmac. The dining hall opened on time, and the daily shift rotations resumed. But behind closed doors, the mood had changed. Officers who had laughed off the first night's events were no longer joking. Too many people had seen too much, and some of it was now on tape. Colonel Halt had returned from the forest in the early hours of December 28th. He was visibly shaken, but composed. The men who went with him, Lieutenant Bruce England, Sergeant Monroe Neville, and others, shared the same look, part disbelief, part quiet tension. They had seen something that didn't fit anywhere in their training or manuals, and now the question was what to do next. No alarms were raised. No immediate reports were sent to higher commands. Instead, the base entered a kind of administrative lockdown. Word spread that any talk of the incident was to stay within the chain of command. No one was to speak to the press. No rumors were to leave the fence. At RAF Bentwaters, the base commander, Colonel Ted Conrad, reportedly reviewed Halt's first notes, but kept his distance from the details. By military rules, unexplained events, especially if they involved possible airspace violations, were supposed to be passed up to higher branches, like the Ministry of Defense or U.S. Air Force Europe. But no immediate transmission seemed to happen. In the background, something else was going on. Quiet damage control. People who had seen parts of the events were spoken to in private. Some were debriefed formally, others informally. A few would later say they were told not to talk about what they saw, not as a threat, but as an understanding that this wasn't something the public should know. Meanwhile, Halt began drafting what would later be known as the Halt Memo. Dated January 13, 1981, over 2 weeks after the incidents, it was addressed to the British Ministry of Defense. The wording was plain and restrained, almost too much so. It summarized the events of December 26th through 28th, using phrases like unexplained lights and metallic object. Nowhere did it suggest alien craft. There were no emotional details, no guessing, just facts in flat military language. This memo would later become public through a Freedom of Information Act request in the U.S., but at the time, it was just another piece of paper in a system known for not reacting to things it couldn't classify. Outside the memo, no other official papers were released. No alerts were issued, no aircraft were scrambled. The radar logs, if they existed, were never shared. It was as if the base had quietly agreed to fold the incident into a box labeled unknown and put it on a shelf no one wanted to open again. And yet, questions spread unofficially. Why had the lights returned on more than one night? Why did equipment fail near the phenomena? Why were radiation levels higher at the landing site? Word eventually reached London. The Ministry of Defense received the halt memo, reviewed it, and quietly filed it away. Their official stance, later repeated to the press, was simple. The incident was of no defense significance. That phrase would become infamous in the years ahead. Many saw it as a dismissal, a bureaucratic way of saying, "We don't want to deal with this." But on the base, silence didn't mean forgetting. Among the men who were there, the memory stayed sharp. Some spoke of it only after retirement. Others stayed quiet for decades. But nearly all agreed on one thing. The incident was real. Something unusual had happened in Rendlesham Forest, and no official explanation ever came. In the weeks that followed, the base went back to normal operations. Security patrols returned to their routes. The strange marks in the forest eventually faded. But the air around the event lingered. Not just the memory, but the sense that something had been deliberately hidden. By mid-January, journalists began sniffing around. A local reporter caught wind of something odd and ran a short story in the East Anglian Daily Times. It didn't cause much stir at first, but when a U.S. researcher named Larry Warren began speaking out, and then more leaks appeared, the story started to spread. Still, the military said little. When pressed, they pointed to the halt memo or repeated that no evidence of a threat had been found. For a Cold War base loaded with sensitive equipment and duties, the idea that they had no interest in a low-flying, glowing object inside their fence line didn't sit well with many. Some men later claimed they were told not to keep personal notes or talk to outside investigators. Others said they weren't pressured, but they knew better than to stir things up. The Cold War taught a certain kind of silence, where unknowns were best left alone unless they caused direct damage. It's worth noting what didn't happen. No recovery team arrived. No high-ranking general took command. No cross-base alert between the UK and US was recorded. The incident simply faded into the unofficial column of unsolved. Important enough to remember, but not to act on. Even today, the UK government says the Rendlesham case was fully investigated and found to pose no risk to national security. The US government, for its part, rarely mentions it at all. But for those who were there, the silence spoke louder than words. The military, trained to act on even the faintest intrusion, had seen something it couldn't classify, and instead of digging deeper, it seemed to look away. That silence, not just in paperwork, but in the faces of those who knew, became part of the story itself. Chapter 8. Public Leaks and Media Frenzy. It began small, like a ripple in a pond. Just a few people knew what had happened. A few had seen the lights. A few had read the memo. And even fewer understood how strange the event really was. But secrets rarely stay buried, especially when too many people are asking quiet questions. By early 1981, whispers about the Rendlesham incident had reached beyond the gates of RAF Woodbridge and Bentwaters. A local journalist at the East Anglian Daily Times picked up talk of something odd in the forest during the Christmas holidays. The first article ran as a curiosity, a short piece titled something like UFO, sighted near Suffolk Base. It didn't name names, it didn't make claims, but it planted a seed. That article might have been forgotten, like so many other small-town oddities, if not for one thing, the leak of the halt memo. Someone, no one knows who for sure, passed a copy to a UFO researcher in the US. That researcher then filed a Freedom of Information Act request and, in 1983, received the official memo. The memo was real. It was signed. It was formal. And it didn't read like science fiction. Suddenly, the story had weight. It wasn't rumor. It wasn't a campfire tale from a soldier who'd had too much to drink. It was a military document summing up several nights of strange lights, odd movements, and physical traces, all inside a NATO base. The memo's release was like opening a pressure valve. Within weeks, the Rendlesham incident was no longer a local rumor. It was an international curiosity. News outlets across the UK picked it up. The BBC ran a segment. Newspapers used phrases like Britain's Roswell. For the first time, the public was hearing official confirmation that something unexplained had happened in Suffolk's quiet pine woods. What followed was a media frenzy. UFO groups sprang into action. Researchers began visiting the forest, talking to witnesses, and collecting their own field data. Some trespassed onto land near the base. Others claimed to find burn marks and radiation readings that hadn't been mentioned before. Dozens of versions of the story began to spread. Some were based on interviews. Others leaned toward the dramatic. And through it all, the Ministry of Defense stood firm. The incident was of no defense significance. That phrase, repeated like a chant, became both a shield and a spark to the public. It felt like an excuse. If there was no importance, then why was the memo written at all? Why had the base gone quiet for weeks? Why were witnesses hesitant to speak? Reporters began tracking down the men involved. Some, like John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, agreed to limited interviews. They described lights in the trees, odd movement patterns, and equipment failures. Penniston in particular began mentioning more unusual elements, including time loss and eventually binary code. But at this stage, most accounts stayed careful. These were military men. They spoke in measured terms, avoiding exaggeration. Others stayed completely silent. Some pointed to official secrecy agreements. Others just didn't want to be labeled. The term UFO still carried a heavy stigma. It was the 1980s, and reputations in the military could be fragile. Still, the media pressed forward. Tabloids picked up the story and ran wilder headlines. Aliens in Suffolk. U.S. base invaded by UFO. The night the sky fell. These articles mixed fact with fiction, blending real witness accounts with dramatic retellings that sometimes barely matched the original events. Television followed print. Rendlesham became the subject of documentaries, late-night talk shows, and eventually mainstream news segments. Audiences were drawn not just to the story, but to the credibility behind it. These weren't civilians seeing strange lights on a country road. These were military personnel, trained observers on a secure base, reporting something they couldn't explain. But as the noise grew, so did the confusion. Different timelines appeared. Some researchers claimed the events happened on different nights than officially recorded. Others suggested multiple objects had been seen, not just one. Witnesses contradicted one another, either by mistake or changing memory, and all of it fed into a growing cloud of uncertainty. The forest itself became part of the story. Journalists and researchers would visit Rendlesham and describe its strange atmosphere. Some said compasses behaved oddly. Others claimed to feel uneasy or watched. A few dug into the forest floor looking for evidence that had long since vanished. The woods, once quiet and forgotten, became a destination for the curious. Then came the documentaries. The BBC and ITV both produced programs interviewing key witnesses and analyzing the halt tape. American networks followed with their own specials. Shows like Unsolved Mysteries and later Ancient Aliens picked up the Rendlesham case, each with its own spin. The story was now part of global pop culture, and still the military refused to change its position. Every request for more documentation was met with the same line. There was no threat, no follow-up investigation, no interest from higher commands. But to outsiders, the very lack of action was suspicious. If it truly was nothing, why the silence? Public interest reached a new level in the 1990s when more witnesses stepped forward. Some brought new claims like symbols on the craft, mind-to-mind communication, or strange health effects. Others rejected those claims, arguing that exaggeration was making the truth harder to see. The Rendlesham case was now caught between memory, belief, and media distortion. What had started as a clear, well-documented encounter was turning into something else, a myth forming in real time. And yet, beneath the chaos, the original facts stayed stubbornly simple. Something happened. Multiple nights, multiple witnesses, physical evidence, a real-time military response, and a formal memo that was never answered. The Rendlesham incident was no longer just a footnote in military records. It had entered the public mind, examined, debated, and broadcast worldwide. But through all the noise, one thing stayed constant: a quiet forest in Suffolk, and the men who stood beneath its trees, watching something move through the darkness that defied explanation. Chapter 9. The debunkers arrive. By the late 1980s, the Rendlesham Forest incident had become one of the most talked about UFO cases in the world. With media attention came pressure, not just for answers, but for closure. And that's when the skeptics stepped in. Their goal wasn't to deny the event happened. Instead, it was to explain it, to turn the strange into the ordinary. The first and most persistent theory came from just a few miles away: the Orfordness Lighthouse. The lighthouse stood on the Suffolk coast several miles to the east. Its beam rotated regularly, sweeping across the horizon every 5 seconds. Skeptics argued that in the right conditions, fog, darkness, stress, the beam could easily appear as a pulsing light deep in the forest. From certain angles, it even seemed to hover. Some said this explained the flashing red and white lights reported by Burroughs and Peniston. Others tied the lighthouse directly to the second night, when Colonel Halt recorded the moving light on his tape. Another explanation focused on bright stars, especially Sirius, which was particularly bright in the December sky. Under stress, skeptics argued, an unusually bright star could appear to move, especially through branches where visual distortion is common. This idea was popular among astronomers who reviewed the case years later. There were also suggestions of hoaxes. One former airman claimed that a group of base personnel had set up lights to play a prank on the security detail. Flashlights, flares, even painted balloons were rumored. The implication was simple: trained military personnel had been fooled by a joke. Skeptics pushed these explanations in television interviews, newspaper pieces, and eventually books. The narrative grew that Rendlesham could be explained by a lighthouse, a bright star, and some imagination. But not everyone agreed, and for good reason. First, there were multiple witnesses across multiple nights, many of whom described movement that didn't match a lighthouse beam. These weren't brief sightings or distant lights. Some reported close encounters. Peniston, in particular, claimed he stood within feet of a structured, silent object. Whether or not his later claims about binary code were true, his first testimony described a craft, not a point of light. Second, radar data complicated the lighthouse theory. Some retired air traffic controllers later said that unidentified objects were tracked near the bases during the same time. While this data was never fully released, several personnel mentioned radar hits that didn't match known aircraft. Third, the Halt tape posed its own problem. During the recording, Halt and his team clearly react to lights moving through the trees, not across the sky. The audio captures confusion, shifting directions, and mention of a metallic sound not consistent with a lighthouse. Compass interference and high radiation readings at the site also resisted easy dismissal. As these facts clashed with skeptical theories, the debate grew. In newspapers, talk shows, and academic circles, two narratives competed, one of mistaken perception and suggestion, and one of real contact with something unknown. The UFO community was divided too. Some researchers leaned heavily into the extraterrestrial idea, framing Rendlesham as proof. Others called for caution, worrying that exaggeration could weaken the case. They focused on what was actually recorded, the memo, the tape, the indentations, and urged others not to add extra claims. Meanwhile, critics accused both sides of cherry-picking evidence. Amid this standoff, a third idea began to surface. The idea that disinformation might be involved. Some asked, what if the military didn't just ignore the sightings, but helped create confusion? The theory was that mixed messages, withheld documents, and vague denials could serve a purpose. By letting the story spin into many competing versions, the original event would lose clarity, becoming just another unsolved mystery. This wouldn't be the first time such tactics were used. In other cases, including those in the US, military agencies had run Project Blue Book-style containment, letting just enough information out while hiding the core truth. In Rendlesham's case, the lack of follow-up and the Ministry of Defense's refusal to act added weight to this theory. Even the release of the HALT memo, some believed, might have been a controlled leak, enough to spark interest, but not enough to answer the real questions. Supporters of this view pointed out how easily the event could be buried. Too many versions, too many voices, and too many contradictions meant no single truth could dominate. If the goal was to hide something under layers of half-truths, it was working. Years later, some witnesses voiced frustration, not just with skeptics, but with the entire community around the case. John Burroughs and Jim Penniston both gave interviews talking about how their memories were doubted, their credibility attacked, and their experiences rewritten by others. They felt trapped in a story that no longer belonged to them. To skeptics, this was more proof that memory is unreliable. To believers, it was proof that something worth hiding had been seen and that the pushback was deliberate. In the end, the arrival of the debunkers didn't end the Rendlesham story. It expanded it. Every explanation sparked a counter-argument. Every skeptical article generated letters, responses, and sometimes threats. The case didn't fade. It broke into pieces, and through it all, one truth remained. Something happened. Lights were seen, objects were described, measurements were taken, and while lighthouses, stars, and hoaxes can explain some sightings, they don't explain them all. In the end, the forest remained silent, but the argument around it grew louder. Chapter 10. Reunions, Regrets, and Retellings. Decades after the lights vanished into the Rendlesham woods, the men who were there that night still carried its weight. Not in the form of medals or awards, but in quiet interviews, scattered memories, and the lasting feeling that something had never let them go. In the early 2000s, a few of the original witnesses began to speak more openly. The Cold War was over. Many were retired. Others were now living as civilians, far removed from their old posts at RAF Woodbridge and Bentwaters. But the forest, the lights, the unexplainable, none of it stayed behind. John Burroughs had stayed mostly quiet for years, but eventually his health began to change. He developed unexplained heart problems. He had surgeries. His medical records, at first kept secret, would eventually become central to a fight, not just for recognition, but for truth. Burroughs claimed the U.S. government had denied him access to his own medical history, calling it classified. After pressure from the media and legal help, the Department of Veterans Affairs finally admitted that his health problems were linked to service-related exposure to an unidentified phenomenon during his time in the military. It was the first, and so far only, official recognition connecting a Rendlesham witness to a physical injury. It didn't make headlines everywhere, but for those following the case, it mattered. Jim Penniston took a different path. He too had stayed quiet at first, but later began sharing more detailed memories, including one that caused deep debate. He claimed he had touched the craft on that first night, that it had no seams, that it gave off a low hum, and that afterward his mind was filled with binary code, long sequences of ones and zeros, that he later said he wrote in a notebook. To some, this sounded too extraordinary, but to others, it was the missing piece, the kind of detail that matched known patterns in other strange events. When decoded, the binary code seemed to point to coordinates of ancient sites around the world, including the pyramids and Stonehenge. Whether meaningful or not, the code became a lasting part of Penniston's story, a mix of memory, experience, and something that still defied explanation. As the years went by, both men began to appear at conferences and in documentaries. They weren't showmen. Their tones were often calm, even uncertain. Neither seemed fully comfortable with the role of UFO witness. They were veterans. They had served in tense conditions, and for decades, they had carried a story that didn't fit into the official world they came from. Their memories, too, had shifted. In some interviews, dates didn't match. Descriptions changed. Was it one night or two? Were there lights in the sky or on the ground? Trauma does that. So does time. And so does the pressure of being asked again and again to describe something that never had a proper name. Other witnesses came forward with similar confusion. Some described anxiety. Others admitted to gaps in memory. A few simply said, "I try not to think about it." The events in the forest weren't the end of anything. They were the start of long, unspoken struggles with credibility, memory, and silence. In 2010, many of the surviving witnesses gathered at Rendlesham Forest for a quiet reunion. It wasn't filmed for TV, it wasn't filled with speeches, but it was meaningful. These were men who had not seen each other in decades, each shaped by what happened or didn't happen, depending on who told the story. There were no clear answers that day, just shared memories, stories that matched in some ways and differed in others. But in the silence of the forest, the weight of the past felt closer. One man brought his grandchildren. Another stood quietly near the trees, scanning the horizon as if still waiting for the lights to return. Not everyone agreed on what they'd seen, but most agreed the experience had changed them, not just in that moment, but for a lifetime. Some dealt with mental health struggles. Others distanced themselves from the UFO community entirely. A few leaned in, hoping their voices might be part of something bigger. Even Colonel Halt, who had tried to stay neutral, eventually became more outspoken. In later years, he appeared in interviews saying, "This was not a lighthouse. This was real." For him, the continued denial of official interest had become the real mystery. If nothing happened, why were files still sealed? Why did it take so long to acknowledge even basic medical claims? The answers never came, but the stories kept coming back, retold in books, podcasts, and YouTube videos, each adding a new layer, a new interpretation, a new generation of listeners. and with every retelling came the same central conflict: truth versus perception. What had the men seen? What had they remembered? What had they been allowed to know? Some researchers argue that trauma, especially under extreme conditions, doesn't erase memory. It reshapes it. That the Rendlesham witnesses weren't unreliable, but altered by the very nature of what they encountered. Not lies, but fractures in time and thought. Others see something simpler, that a strange light in the woods grew into a story too big to contain, that everyone added to it piece by piece until no single version could be confirmed. But for Burroughs and Peniston, the matter never became easier. Recognition came late, if at all. Their names were often used, quoted, and challenged. But few asked how it felt to live with a story that no institution wanted to acknowledge and no community could fully agree on. For them, Rendlesham wasn't folklore. It was personal. It happened while they were awake, in uniform, with eyes open and orders in hand. It didn't go away when they left the service. It followed them into hospitals, into interviews, into notebooks and tapes and questions that still don't have answers. And in the end, maybe that's what makes Rendlesham last. Not just the lights or the tapes or the binary code, but the people, the ones who lived it, who never asked to become part of history, but found themselves there anyway. Chapter 11: New Evidence and the Binary Puzzle. By the 2010s, Rendlesham Forest had become more than just a place. It was a symbol, a place where official secrecy, unexplained events, and personal memory collided. But with time came new voices, and with them new angles that added unexpected layers to a story already full of complexity. Much of that renewed focus centered on Jim Peniston. Decades after the original event, he revealed something he said had been kept secret even from his closest peers. That when he touched the craft in the forest on that first night, he experienced what he described as a mental download, an overwhelming urge to record sequences of ones and zeros. The binary code, he said, wasn't part of his conscious thought. It simply appeared, vivid and persistent. For years, the notebook holding that code stayed in his possession, unpublished. But in 2010, as the 30th anniversary of the Rendlesham incident approached, Peniston came forward with scans of the handwritten pages. The numbers stretched across several sheets. They were long, repetitive, and almost immediately they caught the attention of computer analysts, linguists, and theorists from across the UFO community. One researcher, Nick Siskey, volunteered to decode the sequences using basic binary to ASCII conversion. What emerged shocked many, a series of English words hidden within the digits, as if the message had been encrypted using a simple but deliberate method. The decoded message read, "Exploration of humanity, continuous for planetary advance. Eyes of your eyes. Origin year 8100. It also included a series of geographic coordinates, locations that, when mapped, matched ancient and often mysterious sites across the globe. Giza in Egypt, Nazca in Peru, Sedona in Arizona, Taishan in China, and the Temple of Apollo in Knossos, Greece. But one coordinate stood out more than any other. It pointed to a small area off the coast of Ireland, the supposed location of High Brazil, a mythical island that had appeared on medieval maps for centuries. Often called the Irish Atlantis, High Brazil was said to be hidden in mist, visible only once every 7 years, and home to an advanced civilization. It was legend, folklore. But now it had appeared in the binary code from a UFO incident 3 decades earlier. That connection alone was enough to start a new wave of speculation. Books, podcasts, and video essays followed. Was the Rendlesham craft sending a message not just to the men on duty, but to history itself? Was this code proof of something ancient, an intelligence that had been watching for longer than modern civilization had existed? Others urged caution, not because the binary message was meaningless, but because its timing and presentation raised questions. Skeptics pointed out that Peniston's claim of receiving the code only came years after the event, during a time when interest in Rendlesham had begun to fade and anniversary press coverage was returning. The notebook itself, while dated to 1980, could not be independently proven as containing those exact pages back then. The chance of later editions couldn't be ruled out. Psychologists spoke up too. They noted that trauma and high-stress situations can lead to memory being reshaped after the event. The mind can organize experiences into clearer, even symbolic, forms. Could Peniston have truly believed he received a message, even if the code appeared later through subconscious processes? Still, other observers asked a different question. Even if the binary code was made after the event, where did the message come from? The language was strange. Phrases like "eyes of your eyes" weren't typical. The inclusion of precise GPS coordinates suggested more than a simple hoax, and the year 810, whether real or imagined, suggested a non-human timeline altogether. Within the UFO research community, the debate over the binary code became one of Rendlesham's most dividing issues. For some, it was the centerpiece, evidence of intelligent, non-terrestrial communication. For others, it was an unnecessary complication, distracting from the stronger parts of the case: the multiple trained witnesses, the halt tape, the physical marks on the ground. And then came new witnesses, not of the original event, but of what followed. In the 2010s, former radar operators, security personnel, and support staff began stepping forward with small but consistent statements that something unusual had happened on those nights. That radio chatter had spiked, that equipment had failed, and that higher-ups had given direct orders not to talk about it. One anonymous source, later featured in a documentary, claimed that U.S. intelligence agents arrived within 48 hours of the incident and began interviewing key personnel. Another recalled seeing logs removed from radar rooms. None of it could be proven beyond doubt, but these new voices added depth to the lingering question: was something being covered up, not to mislead the public, but to contain a truth even officials didn't fully understand? The topic of disinformation came up again, not just as silence, but as planned confusion. Some theorists suggested that conflicting details, competing accounts, and media distractions weren't accidents. They were useful. If the story stayed messy, it would never become usable. It would never grow into more than a curiosity. And with each passing year, the fog around the case grew thicker. Still, the binary code remained, printed in books, shared on forums, carved into the Rendlesham timeline, as something that could not be ignored, but could not be explained either. For Jim Peniston, the message was real. Whether anyone believed it or not seemed less important. He had carried it for decades, written it down before he understood it, and offered it not as proof, but as part of the experience. To him, it was a transmission, not from aliens, not necessarily even from the future, but from something watching, waiting, or maybe reminding us that we're not as alone or as rooted as we think. And for Rendlesham, it meant the case hadn't ended. It had grown. New documents were still being released through declassification requests. Old witnesses were speaking again with new clarity, and new listeners, young, less skeptical, more curious, were arriving to ask the same questions over and over. Not because the story needed exaggeration, but because the truth had never fully come out. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Rendlesham. Rendlesham Forest is quiet now. Trees sway gently in the soft breeze. The narrow paths once trampled by boots are now softened by moss and leaves. To a casual visitor, it's just another woodland. Calm, rural, ordinary. But beneath that silence lingers something else. Not a haunting exactly, but a lasting echo. A question that never quite settled. More than 4 decades have passed since the events of late December 1980, and still no official explanation has closed the matter. There was no final report, no declassified document that ended the file. Instead, Rendlesham endures. A case unresolved, continuously studied, and fiercely debated. It remains the most important and well-documented UFO incident in the United Kingdom's history. What makes Rendlesham unique isn't just the unidentified lights or a strange object in the woods. It's the structure of the case. Multiple trained military witnesses, physical trace evidence, real-time audio recordings, internal memos, and a chain of command caught in the middle of something they couldn't identify and couldn't fully deny. Unlike quick sightings from a lone civilian or blurry photos of distant shapes, the Rendlesham event unfolded within the perimeter of a NATO airbase with security protocols, command procedures, and written records. In that way, Rendlesham holds the same place in British UFO history that Roswell does in American memory. But while Roswell has been softened by myth and blurred by decades of retelling, Rendlesham remains more concrete. It is not just folklore. It's a timeline of transcripts, testimonies, and disputed evidence that lives in public archives, FOIA releases, and official interviews. It didn't happen in a desert. It happened under trees, on military time, with people who still walk among us. International comparisons only make the case stronger. The Phoenix Lights of 1997, a massive V-shaped formation seen by thousands in Arizona, had no military acknowledgement and was dismissed as flares. The 2004 Nimitz encounter, where U.S. Navy pilots chased a tic-tac-shaped object off California, had radar data and cockpit video, but no ground-based contact. In contrast, Rendlesham involved soldiers on the ground, sustained observation, and post-event investigation by officers like Charles Halt, whose own recording during the second night remains one of the only real-time audio documents from any military UFO encounter in history. And yet, despite all this, no broader disclosure has followed. The Rendlesham case sits in a strange middle ground, too strange to dismiss, too difficult to explain, and too politically sensitive to pursue. For years, observers have asked the same question. Will the truth ever come out? Some remain hopeful. They point to the recent wave of government transparency in the U.S., where official acknowledgement of unidentified aerial phenomena has entered the congressional record. New whistleblowers, intelligence briefings, and task forces suggest that secrecy is beginning to weaken. If that continues, they argue, cases like Rendlesham will eventually be re-examined in a new light. But others aren't as hopeful. They believe Rendlesham was never ignored. It was studied, assessed, and filed away under levels of classification we may never see. They suggest the real issue isn't disclosure, but control. If something unknown entered the airspace of a nuclear-armed military base twice and no one could stop it, then admitting that isn't just about telling the truth. It's about power, about vulnerability. And that's not something governments like to reveal. In the years since, many of the key witnesses have aged into retirement. Some remain outspoken, attending conferences, appearing in documentaries, answering questions that never really stopped. Others have stepped back, perhaps tired of repeating the same story to audiences split between belief and ridicule. For men like Jim Penniston and John Burroughs, Rendlesham wasn't just a mystery, it was a scar. A moment that split time in two, before and after. The forest itself has changed too. A walking trail now marks the UFO path with information boards, memorial signs, and replicas of the object reportedly seen that night. Tourists visit. School groups walk the trail. It's peaceful, almost quaint. But for those who were there in 1980, the trees still carry weight. Memory clings to the bark. Ultimately, the legacy of Rendlesham isn't just in what was seen, it's in what it meant. To some, it's confirmation. To others, confusion. But above all, it remains a benchmark, a case that resists resolution and demands attention. In an era of deep fakes and digital tricks, Rendlesham endures because it's analog, etched in cassette tape hiss, handwritten reports, and voices that have stayed consistent for over 40 years. Will we ever know exactly what happened? Maybe not. Maybe the story was never meant to be solved. Maybe its value lies not in answers, but in the way it challenges our certainty, in the space it opens for questioning, for possibility, for wonder. Because belief is not weakness, nor is skepticism cowardice. The search for truth lives between the two, in careful study, in listening without judgment, and in leaving room for things we can't yet define. In the end, the Rendlesham incident reminds us of something simple, that beneath our routines, beneath the systems we build and the control we think we hold, there are still moments when the unknown breaks through quietly, without warning, just lights in the trees. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. Thank you for joining us tonight, dreamers. The Rendlesham Forest incident remains one of the most mysterious UFO encounters in modern history. What do you think really happened that night? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. We hope this story helped you relax, and we look forward to sharing more from our Unknown series next time. Until then, sleep well and dream of disclosure.